All right, the next physical principle I'd like to discuss is Metsuke. Metsuke is how we use our eyes. Obviously, we use our eyes for seeing. That's normal. But how we use the focal point of our gaze is really what Metsuke is talking about. The focal point is the point of concentration where your eyes converge on a target. And in technical terms, that's called a parallax, the parallax of the eyes. We train the parallax of the eyes in Metsuke repeatedly, over and over and over again, to reference point this distance, this same distance we talked about in Tegatana. When we see a measurement of distance in Aikido for Mai, for instance, we're referencing the same distance over and over again until such a time that when you're gazing at your partner from some random space, we'll just get random, and I use my eyes locked onto the focal point of his eyes, or the point right between his eyes actually, because you don't want to become lured into gazing into their eyes themselves. Looking into the other person's eyes can sometimes have a lulling or a hypnotic effect. You'll start getting signals coming from their eyes to your eyes. You'll wind up getting very distracted sometimes. So we're actually, even though I'm using the focal point of his eyes, I'm actually using the point between his eyes, the uto, right there. So that's my focal point. When we're at some random distance, and we've been closing, we're going to close gradually, very incrementally, and right about here, that focal point has told me that we are now at the range where we have perfect Mai. So Metsuke is the mechanism whereby we establish Mai in an unconscious, consistent reflex. For a long time, you have to measure that distance to create that reference point. So you physically restructure, oh, here's Mai right there. Your focal point can be on the middle finger of your hand extended. But you transfer that to a partner now, and we move in, and right there, here we are. You're at Mai because your focal point has been trained, that parallax has been trained to know that this is the absolute distance that you want to be responding to. It's a triggering mechanism that we build into our activity. Metsuke also has the property of having a defocused gaze. So after you've developed this very locked down point in space that you're responding to, there's a second type of Metsuke that comes into play. And this is referred to as gazing at the distant mountains. By gazing at the distant mountains, what we're talking about is as I look at my partner, in the first instance, I was locked into a gaze onto his uto point right between his eyes. But now as I look at him, I look through him. I'm really looking past him. I have a general view. My face is facing that way. My eyes are facing that way. But the eyes soften, and I'm actually gazing at the whole picture. I'm looking as much peripherally as I am at the focal point, and I'm allowing the peripheral vision to become a more dominant feature of the activity. That's very important. When we defocus our gaze and gaze as if at the distant mountains, as it's called, we use Metsuke in a way that relaxes one part of our reactive mechanism and wakes up a different part of our reactive mechanism. When we go into our peripheral vision as a responsive, triggered form, we're actually invoking a part of our nervous system more tied to our instinctual, automatic, unconscious type of movement. When we lock down on a focal point like we're reading, for instance, our forebrain, the front part of our brain gets involved in thinking and figuring out and planning and structuring and ideas, and it's a whole different process. So when we're eating and reading and what have you, but when we're gazing out at the distant mountains, we invoke an entirely different part of our subconscious to be active and aware and monitoring, and it's much faster. It's much quicker, and it's much more efficient in dealing with the person's movements. Again, in the context of Budo, we're dealing with the potential for violence. We're dealing with the potential for combat. We're dealing with taking something very dysfunctional and bringing it into function. We're trying to invoke the most efficient tools we have at hand. And over time, all the way back through the ancient samurai sword days, they found this way of using the eyes as if gazing at the distant mountains was a much quicker form of using the eyes than if you got locked into the forebrain focal point. So you only do that focal point parallaxing idea until that becomes habitually imbued. Once it's in place, then automatically allow those eyes to soften and go to the next step. And that's Metsuke. Thank you.